Yeah.
And so we'd be delighted if any of you are able to complete that survey. And then what we'll do from that, we'll select some mini cases. So we'll do that, and there'll be an opportunity to present the results back at a session here, maybe present a case in Henley, etc., etc. But basically, we want to change some of those broken messages about enterprise architecture and really raise the capability, raise the profile, and get that across. And we've got one of the people on the Henley program, Simon, so I guess you can talk to people personally about that experience. Thanks for that. Excellent. So any questions? I'll be around. Please do come and say hello and ask me anything you like.
There we are, EASG.org. And if you fill it out, then you get a free day at Henley, something like that. Isn't that right? Free lunch at Henley, yeah. Something like that. Anyway, great. So that's all of that out of the way. So I'd now like to introduce you to John McNaughton. John has kindly agreed to speak to us tonight through a rather circuitous route. John works for a company called Mood International. Anyone heard of Mood International? Okay, a great British technology story in the enterprise architecture space. And at the beginning of the year, I thought the one company we should try and get along, one of the number, is somebody from that. So hopefully John will give us a little bit of background about the company. Tonight's theme is about real time. And I think that's, again, particularly exciting. It's a theme that John sort of suggested. And I think it's affecting everything all the time. It's affecting not just the machines and the technology, but also the cycle times that we have to deliver against, and the constant, always-on sort of stuff that we have to put up so that our customers can feel that they can log in or dial up or be in sessions. So those are old-fashioned terms, aren't they? But be online 24 hours a day. He's a principal consultant with Mood, and is going to offer us a perspective on how enterprise architecture and systems engineering can stay significant by moving our mindset from the long-term background projects to creation of tangible, connected and real-time views of things that matter. We'll run for about 20 minutes, nice short presentation, and then we're going to have a really good, hunky discussion and Q&A. Over to you, John.
Dawn, thank you very much. Good evening. Laura and I had a conversation probably about 2 months ago about the format of this, and I'd just been watching some TED Talks, and I thought that was a good idea. Laura absolutely agreed, so that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, 18, 20 minutes, something like that, and then lead into the conversation. The big difference between me speaking and the TED Talk speaks is they tend not to use their notes, as I'm going to, because I ran out of rehearsal time. So the title of this is Making It Real is about making it real time. That's putting architectures in front of people so that they can engage with it. Not just other architects, the whole range of users. So with our background, we all understand that architecture and engineering takes time and effort to get it right. But very often, while we're busy thinking our deep thoughts and worrying about the things that we need to worry about, the environment in which we're working is changing. And if we accept that simply as a fact of life, then there's a real risk that we become detached from the problems that we're trying to solve. So I've got some experience of making architecture and engineering a little bit more pertinent to end users, very much with the idea of bringing the benefits that we so often talk about within range of the people that we're talking to about those benefits. Simply put, or the premise of I'm going to head down the line of, is that by connecting to sources of information and data as rapidly as possible and applying a user-based approach to what we're doing, we should be able to show the end users what their business landscape really looks like and what interventions and decisions they can make based on our presentation. So we've all met decision makers, we probably are decision makers, but in the business sense, the decision makers, they concentrate very much on what they need to do right now. Telling them what they should have done yesterday or that have the information for them in 3 years' time really isn't working so much as it used to. So I'm going to suggest that we need to move our centre of effort into creating iterative, deployed architectures that update themselves in real time and give the decision maker situational awareness on their business. So, as Rob said, I'll offer my perspective. If you disagree with it, I'm very delighted to have that conversation. I think I can defend it. If you all stand up at the end and go, yeah, that's marvellous, tell us something new and leave, I'll feel greatly harmed. Okay. So, who am I and why would you bother listening to me? So, I spent a little bit of time in the Navy, which I think is about 26 years. I've been outside of the Navy for about 9 years, working for Moon throughout that time, doing consulting, and I'm now the product owner in an agile sense for the Moon product. But I didn't start my career in this space. I started it in submarines, and I was at the front end. I was not an engineer, I was an operator. It was periscopes, torpedoes, comm systems, navigation for me. And I don't know if it's immediately obvious, but it was actually, in hindsight, a terrific place to learn about architecture and systems engineering and things like that, because although in some places the design and some of the methods are unchanged in 50 years, some of it is very much cutting edge. I certainly remember being involved in a sonar project where we changed the processors 3 times in the design because the pace of change had moved so quickly. So in this environment you can learn a lot about design, standards, safety, risk managing. It is a real combination of hardware, software and peopleware. And one of the things I think I learned about it is that when things go wrong, you get equipped with some ways of thinking about what to do next. So I left boats probably when I was about 34, 35, and I found myself buying them. And you obviously can't go to McNaughton's and Tandy and get these. So I was involved very much in combat system integration, combat system design, those sorts of things, particularly when it was about delivering information to the decision maker, who in a submarine is clearly the captain. How does all of that information, how do 120 people work to getting one bloke to making the right decision? So having done that, I found myself as an operator very ill-equipped with some of the terminology. The Navy very kindly sent me on some postgraduate training, which taught me a bit, but it mostly taught me that I just needed to use the right language sometimes. So I went on to advising the Navy on all things sort of information, procuring information systems, information management, knowledge management, those sorts of things. And then I led an information strategy project where I first dropped into graphical modelling, which is probably about the same time that I met Sally B. Just about the time that the MOD was creating its architectural framework, and architecture was becoming a word. I don't think I knew it as architecture at that time. So since then I've worked on defence logistics, service-oriented architecture, service personnel strategies and how that is enabled by IT. I've done a little bit of work in the charitable side of things, but it's mostly been defence-oriented, I'll say. And at the moment, I've spent the last few years working in very much on the system engineering and government side of things. And all the time that I've been doing this, over the last 10 years, I'm becoming increasingly convinced that a lot of the people that are very close to this don't necessarily think about it in a way that best supports their case. What should be treated as projects very often gets treated as business as usual. And there is an effort to be methodical and structured in what we're doing, which I applaud. But I will say that at the very start of a project, if somebody in the room is talking about version control, my heart sinks. and I become convinced that they are a million miles from the mindset that's actually going to get anything done, and they're settling into they're just settling into, we're just going to turn the handle on this. And I'm going to suggest that we need to get away from that. So there's people that think about version control and all these things, and I think slow things down a little bit. There are some other people who go through life just cuffing it. And for the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to ignore them because I'm going to take the view that they're beyond redemption and that we shouldn't trouble ourselves too much there. But in the middle ground, there's a method that I sometimes describe as work out what you're trying to do, work out what's going on now, build a better version. And it looks a bit like this. Certain amount of logical architecture, certain amount of as is, followed by a certain amount of to be architecture. And I'll say, my experience, I sail boats by the way, and if you want to win a sailing race, you have to do three things. You have to start well, you have to sail really well, and you have to finish well. But in real life, it doesn't really work like that all the time. Things go wrong, and very often it goes wrong quickly. Things become very quickly disconnected and disjointed, particularly if you're sinking into lots of long project syndrome. What was a nice, tight, interconnected, loosely coupled, highly cohesive plan just encounters real life. I don't know how many of you have encountered the phrase the square of despair, but users, policy, funding, security, all of these things will do their utmost to blow your plan out of the water. So your logical plan gets disconnected from the work that you're doing on the as-is, gets disconnected from what it is that you're trying to deliver, and as they get further apart, trying to bring them together starts to consume all your resources. So I think that how it should work has three problems. It starts too late, finishes too early, and it gets too difficult in the middle. What do I mean by it starts too late? Well, in the view of what we're going to do is we're going to pick up the logical and we're going to run with it, actually you weren't engaged early enough. You've been given the what's going to happen, you haven't really got the why is it going to happen. Without that, there's a key thing missing in context, and tiny little bit of an example. You can see when you're dealing with somebody who's dealing with something that's changed its state. Some people talk about whether it's in state A or state B, and some people talk about why did it change or what causes it to change from state A to state B. The people who are talking about the cause, by and large, have a much better grip on the overall context. I also see that particular distinction as the big differentiator between dashboards, and lots of people talking about dashboards at the moment, but also talking about management information. I see the dashboards being a simple replication of values. I see the management information very much being a complex representation of the value. Business outcomes, I think, need to be right at the heart of what we're talking about. Sorry, I'm just going to go back. I talked about it finishing too early as well. So how many times has your lovely, well-crafted plan, design, whatever, been handed over to a group of people who are supposed to pick it up and run with it, and they simply don't recognise it, they weren't engaged in the conversation, they therefore reject it, they take the view that they understand what was wanted and redo all of your work. Your architecture becomes shelfware because of the failures of manage the boundary. It's often the case that the electrician thinks he knows what the user wanted much more than the architect who laid down the original design. I talked about it wasting time in the middle as well. So I used to very much buy the idea of modelling the as-is as a powerful way of gaining some insight into what was actually happening in the space. But what I encounter is a slightly slavish idea that in order to build a model of the future, you have to refer to a model of the past. I find that slightly distressing, because it's a good way of losing a whole pile of time and not actually delivering anything. I remember once being on a destroyer where we had a naval architect on board. And one day I found him in a cabin and he was busy drawing a layout of the ship. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm a naval architect. I'm drawing a layout of the ship." I said, "Why are you doing that? This one's already been built." He looked a little bit crushed, and he went out for a little bit of a walk, but I think he had got into a trap where he had confused the activity associated with the discipline as the outcome that he was trying to get to. So, is there an alternative? Well, we could, of course, just cuff it. But what I would say is, and I'll give a slightly different model, and my perception of this is that we actually want to get a lot closer to the decisions that are being made and the evidence on which those decisions are being made. So we need to start with understanding the business outcomes. Now, clearly, this absolutely depends on the organisation that we're dealing with, or the enterprise that we're dealing with. Military organisations might want certain types of force elements at a certain level of readiness in order to deal with certain scenarios. Procurement organisations are going to want to know that things are being delivered to cost and time within spec and across a whole life cycle. HR-based organisations are going to want to know that their people are well trained, educated, well motivated, and they're staying inside a legislative boundary. These are better things to worry about as whole outcomes than have I got enough tanks, is that project inside its variants, etc., etc. This isn't really about measuring the things that are easy to measure. This is about understanding them in their context. So, for example, having extremely low defect rates on your product is only really interesting if your product's actually in use. The other thing I would say is that you absolutely need to understand the enduring persona involved in your enterprise and their goals. This architecture activity needs to be done with the decision makers and not to them. You're taking them on a journey, and it's going to be much more valuable to both of you if you show them some of the scenery on the way. Notwithstanding the fact that persona is a little bit of an overloaded term, I can't stress highly enough how much understanding that persona, their goals, and properly analysing what it is they're trying to do and how that manifests them in their day-to-day lives is very important. Building something that is useful for a one-off activity or for a monthly audit or something like that tends to be disconnected from real life. Absolutely wireframe out very early what their interface with the architecture is going to look like, and avoid the temptation or indeed the push from them to show them everything. You absolutely need to respect the fact that their worlds are going to be complex, but that doesn't mean you need to expose all of the complications. I quite often will challenge people to say that the perfect management information dashboard in the perfect organisation would be a solitary green light, and that you'd be able to drill down from that, bringing everything up to the top. I don't horribly buy. So, in terms of exposing that, use stories and goals in order to get to what it is that they're after. These things are much more engaging than requirements. Story and the goals come together and create a memorable narrative that the users can map onto. It doesn't have the abstraction that we normally drive in that alienates the user base. This will give customers and the users confidence that you really understand the issues. Developing stories in workshops can be very productive at engaging stories that prompt other stories. When new stories are thrown up, you can then go back and re-clarify the goal and say, okay, so there is a new requirement, there is a new story. Actually, how does that fit in terms of meeting the overall goal? Another big advantage of the persona side of things is that it establishes a great deal of empathy and understanding of the individuals who are going to use this. It builds makes much more strong the dynamic between the people who are building and the people who are consuming this sort of information, which is vitally important, particularly in the mid stages of these sorts of activities. In fact, it's valuable at all stages of the development, and you should always be saying to yourself, that insight that we've got, that's really useful, but is Claire or Bill going to really use it? Is it going to be useful in the context of one of the journeys on which they're engaged? So once you have your first cut, abstract view of underpinning your business landscape, and very much in the language of the business, don't translate everything into your language, keep it in their language. From there, we actually need to get to real things quite quickly. At this point, we then need to start thinking about the information and the data that we're going to have to start exposing. So what are they interested in? The devil will be in the detail of this. How many of these? How expensive are they? When does it get delivered? At what risk? And we're going to need to connect up lots of very messy data. One of the insights that I would have from that is that the users very rarely, if ever, understand what a mess is lying underneath their business. So there's a real art to getting the right level here. If you bring in everything and connect to everything, then you run the risk of simply replicating the systems that have hitherto failed to deliver any insight. You need to do a degree of abstraction, getting the right level of relationships. Too much, you find yourself swamped, and too little won't tell anybody anything. Again, what will happen at this point is the users will start saying, I want to see everything. And the reality is that they don't really. There'll be lots of relationships that need to be exposed. As I say, it is tempting when you've got it available to you to start bringing it out, but don't avoid that. Only expose those that are required to join up your user stories and your goals to the outcomes. So as soon as you've got something worth showing, I think you move into a phase of then showing it in the support of decisions and interventions. I'm surprised very often by a tendency to hide what's being done. It's not ready yet, I can't show you it, I've got some more work to do. Absolutely accept that if you release something ill-prepared and half-baked, then it can be counterproductive. But I think as a community we've got quite a lot to learn from the agile mindset at this point. Notwithstanding the fact that I think that agile is a very overloaded term, and I'm happy to come back to that. But plan to get things done and then do them. Advertise when you're going to do them and have them done by there and know what done looks like. Plan releases, plan phases of deployment of your architecture, harden them. Don't treat the interface and security as something that you can paste on at the end, but don't let it drive you off course. And the other thing that I would say is absolutely plan in that you're going to have to refactor. I did a project earlier on this year, and in the 3 proofs of concept that we thought were going to be quite straightforward, we refactored completely at each stage. And we had to do that. What we were seeing was very much a case of the as-is described by some users wasn't the as-is that really was there and wasn't supporting the decisions that they needed to make. backing that up, or sort of saying that in a slightly different way, I would, really be active rather than passive. By passive architecture, I mean there's something that you might browse, like a novel or a magazine, in the hope that somebody had already built a view that you might need. An active architecture is one that you use because it has been built in a way that it contains vital information to the lifeblood of the organisation, that people need to go to it, that it fits in with things that they're trying to achieve. The Chief Operating Officer, the CIO, CDO, the CEO, they should all feel at home being able to navigate it and interrogate it on their own. I do remember being a bystander at a working session where a senior military officer got up in front of his architecture, and there was a supplier in the room who was very annoyed at the way his team were being prepared as not performing. The management information was showing that this wasn't as it was. He was then informed that this was information that was coming direct from the systems untouched by human hands that were coming from his team. So that fixed a couple of things. That fixed those links, that's for sure. So if I was to summarise, I would very much say, start with the outcomes, know the personas and their goals, connect up just enough data to get to a logically justifiable decision, know how the decision making is supported by the data, and then putting the evidence in full view, move on to the next problem, and continue to repeat that pattern until such time as your architecture is acknowledged as real-time and self-sustaining. So my question would be, I think that this as a method will get you very quickly and very safely to what I would describe as a first base, and as a good way of realising benefits early, whilst building credibility and being relevant. I am done.
Great. Thank you, John. So, let's open it up for a bit of discussion. Can you go back to that last diagram? Because I think that's the core of where we're at. Let's just talk around it. Are there any thoughts, questions? One there and then one at the back, yeah.
I was intrigued at the idea of somehow going from a logical view to an as-is view to a to-be view. I've always felt that you could look at logical and physical, conceptual, and then as-is and to-be in each of those, so there's a grid rather than some flow.
Yeah.
I'm coming from information management, but I think that would be applicable across the thing, so I'm a challenge to that idea. Can you justify it a little more?
Yeah, so I deliberately simplified it. I'm very comfortable with horizontal and vertically integrated architectures with layers of data providing the glue to get you down from layer to layer and having that traceability and so forth. I was really cartooning for effect. So if you had your architecture as some sort of conceptual, then logical, then an information layer, then an as-is, then a to-be, very comfortable with that as well. I was very much simplifying it to say, actually, what I don't really buy is the follow a method from the top of a framework to the bottom and then switch it on.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting perspective that you presented there, because traditionally architects would see the holistic view, which is what I think you're saying with the logical and the as-is to be. And it seems what you're saying there is, rather than try and go for this holistic view, let's really engage with the organisation, let's see what's important to the organisation, what's going to add value. And we'll look at the decisions and we'll build up this architecture step by step. And so I guess a couple of questions emerge from that is, first of all, what sort of decisions are you talking about there that are going to drive this? And how do you then address the architect's sort of nirvana position of having holistic architecture, or do you not bother about that? Is it like Zeno's paradox, or whether you never get there?
So, I think that the people who are making decisions are going to make decisions, and the time base that they're going to work on is going to be directly proportional or inversely proportional to the amount of stress they're on. A friend of mine describes this as whack-a-mole. If you've got a chief executive who is facing 5 really nasty decisions, he's going to try and whack all 5 of them really hard and really quickly without putting a huge amount of thought into them. If you can reduce the number of problems that they're facing, then they're going to spend more time thinking about them, and they'll be more engaged, and that things will move a lot more slowly. So, sorry if that's a mangled metaphor. So instead of saying, I'm going to listen to you about your problem, then as an architect, I'm going to go away and I'm going to quietly do a whole pile of research and bring to bear all of my systems thinking and my architectural approaches, and I'll come back to you in X amount of months with a recommendation for what you should do. Then I think that building that time delay in isn't going to help him in the short term, and actually isn't going to do the credibility of the architecture team any good whatsoever. Somebody mentioned, I can't remember where it was, there was a reference in the introduction somewhere about to architecture having a bad name. I can't remember where it is, but I've seen a number of architecture initiatives that badged themselves as architecture and said, actually, we're subject matter experts in this, we understand all of this, if you apply a bit of systems thinking, it'll be marvellous. Stand up a team and we'll come back in a year's time. And they go one of 2 ways. They either become ivory towers or they become very bloated. They don't deliver. The person that commissioned the work wonders where all of his operating costs have gone for a year, and has possibly even changed over by the time they come back. I'm going to give another little bit of an example of this, which might be a bit more real. And it's not to do with architecture, but it's to do with the engagement with the problem. So, I can't remember which construction company it was or which rail accident it was, but large rail accident, large construction company responsible for doing some work. They got kicked off the job. In the process of getting kicked off the job, the chief operating officer went into the safety cell for that team and found 60 safety analysts sitting in a room studying designs. He shut that office down, he took those 60 people, he embedded them in project teams and got them to put their safety expertise into rolling stock, signalling and those sorts of things. And they were back employed again 9 months later. Now, that might be testament to something, but the idea of a group of architects sitting in a dark room thinking deep thoughts, I think, and right at the beginning of my introduction, I think that is a recipe for becoming disconnected with the business and doing the whole of the profession a disservice.
You mentioned at the beginning about the artificial will be able to update himself every time. How is it going to be done? Is it going through the agile mindset or AI or different things?
So it depends what information it is that you're going to need, and absolutely there is data and information sitting in a vast range of systems, all of different sorts of types, and I'm not for a minute suggesting that we plumb our architecture straight onto those data sources without doing something in the middle. How we tend to approach this is we understand almost the aggregating view of what's required, and very often that means bringing data together from different systems. Therefore, it's important to put a layer that allows you to blend that data. And you stage the information that you need for your architecture in that blended layer. So you don't touch the real stuff, you bring things in, you join them such that you can then lift off from that point. If I could give an example, we did a project that involved managing a complex portfolio of projects. Now, the organisation had a project management system, they had a risk system, they had a scheduling system, they had 37 systems, but it meant that nobody could say this project compares to that project in the context of its risk, time, requirements, those sorts of things. They had to do is put a layer in that allowed us to aggregate from the stuff below in order to present the appropriate information at the right layer, all on one page. What the user didn't want to be doing was saying, that project's late, it's not going to deliver its requirements, but everybody's saying it's, the traffic lights are green. They wanted all of that together. Now, sometimes that doesn't work so well because actually some of the data you bring together, so you have to be quite careful about what you bring together, otherwise you...
Following on from that point, there's a big sort of religion almost in government about open data and how good open data is. Have you got any thoughts on that?
My experience of this is that everybody's assessment of the data that they've got and the quality of it vastly exceeds what happens when you try to join it to something else or aggregate it. You find that you say, there is a business rule, and if I apply this business rule to this data, I'll get that insight. And you do that, and it's not what the end user expected. So that's much more of a conversation about quality and volumes of data. I don't quite know how it's going to go. I don't know if there's a difference. A bit like service-oriented architecture. On paper, absolutely green. Why wouldn't everybody want it? And the fact was that nobody wanted to refactor everything. What they did was build layers on what they had already. Tidying stuff up is really hard work.
Yeah.
Knowing that it's not right is helpful, but it doesn't fix it.
And also there's a load of aspects of the data being in context in one system and drag it somewhere else.
Yes. Yes. A perfect example, going back to yours, the project I was talking about was the MOD. They had 37, and they have projects and they have programs. 37 systems interpret programs differently. So you couldn't compare programs because they were adding things up differently. You had to, in this system, that program is that, and in this system it's a combination of those things, and you have to put that integration layer together quite cleverly. Otherwise, and if you just try to fix all of the data, you won't get to the decision. You'll spend your whole life fixing these feeds and understanding the causal links.
What about requirements? Yeah. You've got sort of requirements coming in from different directions. How do you prioritise and set them for an iteration?
So, by and large, I hate requirements with a passion. And if we go back to, I'm going to talk about why I hate requirements for a minute. How many requirements?
One. Too many.
One.
Too many.
Too many. When this is the astute, the requirement was arguably one. We'd like a new nuclear submarine that is no worse than the one we've already got. And actually, it was slightly worse than that. We'd like a new nuclear submarine, and we'd like it to be no worse than the one we'll have when it comes into service. Okay? And there was another set of requirements which got delivered in an ISO container once they'd been printed out, because there were 35,000 of them. The most useful documents in terms of helping the designers to build this were the context documents that were written as follows. The user is going to do this, they're expecting it to use like that. When this is happening, this is likely to be important. So I hate requirements, but I absolutely accept that in a world that has contracts in it, then you need some stakes in the ground in order to provide something for commercial to do. So you do need them. So my feeling is that you absolutely write requirements, but you link them to the people and what they're trying to do, and you write the requirements in terms of those sorts of stories. If you have to write them in a requirements or a format, that's fine. but then you work out which ones you're going to do first and you do those ones first. Even if it isn't technically the best way to do it, if it would really be best to do 3 requirements and then deliver them as a batch, I'd say deliver 1 requirement first and suck up the pain of doing the other 2 or 3 out of sync, because it means that you're supporting this person and this person, and it will probably fund you getting to requirements 2 and 3.
And how do you prioritise them?
Conversations. And this is where I'm increasingly a fan of the whole agile way of doing it. I'll write these things down, articulate them well, and that often doesn't get as much priority as it should do. Articulate them well, group them nicely, attach them to features, tag them so you can cut them according to what it is you're doing, and then just say, you know what, that's the important one, we're going to do that one first. And you do everything that you need to do in order to get that one done. And if you sweep up some that have gone along the way, that's fine. If you absolutely cause yourself pain downstream, you just have to take that one on the chin, because the important thing is to deliver something early.
The start of 10 business outcomes and you're feeding in, so you're going bottom up, and then from your top down you're saying your start of 10 business outcomes. But as we were discussing outside, what about the business operating model? What about the capabilities to enable that business model, process orchestration and all that stuff? I think we'll have this discussion offline, but I think, you know, enterprise architecture in a military context, and that's what we've got loaded up, and really look at enterprise architecture in a commercial context, are 2 different ways, 2 different mindsets. I think in a military context, I totally agree with everything you're saying. But if we were to take it to a commercial context, I would say the start of the 10 is not your business outcomes, it's your business operating model. For instance, if you're a bank and all of a sudden you've got to introduce Sarbanes-Oxley, or if you're operating in Brazil and you've got e-social, you know, it doesn't matter about your business outcomes, you know, your operating model has changed, so all the systems, your technology landscape has to support that. So in a military context, I would agree, but within a military context, when you talk about data and information, you've got to protect the market. And sometimes you will have systems that are siloed because some are classified, some are restricted, and so on.
So,
my point is quite simple. From a military, you know, if you've got a military mindset and you're looking at this model, spot on. But if you're in the commercial world, the model slightly changes because you've got different drivers.
so there's 2 things in there. One is there are important things sitting behind this, like the business operating model, like regulatory frameworks, those sorts of things that you need to consider. Absolutely right that. I'm less convinced about the distinction to do with the context. I think that I've seen very different things, and I have a large number of colleagues and I'm involved in projects on which they're working. Many of the same pressures, admittedly coming from slightly different perspectives, but so I'm not convinced about that. But do I buy that you should have, that you absolutely need an operating model? Yes,
Well,
absolutely.
I'm not saying that's your start for 10, but if you go into any enterprise architecture function, you know, they're normally looking at business capabilities and business services and the processes that support that. The systems below it, it's about the enablers of the capabilities and services.
Yeah.
But it's different mindset.
It is a slight, it is a different mindset.
I probably defer more to John's side than to that side, because I suppose I work more in IT consultancy, but I see a lot of companies, actually, if they don't do something about business outcomes, they will go out of business. The operating model, who cares what the operating model is? Actually, so for a long-term stable business, maybe something like a bank, but even that's dodgy now, then operating model with clients, the regulatory environment is very important to how they work. But I think the business world, at least in small and medium companies, is now moving so quickly actually business outcomes. And so I'm more thinking, a lot of work in, say, retail.
So
And
a business
actually
outcome
retailers going,
But
usually go out of business.
The business
If they don't
outcome,
deal
and I
with
think I agree, it couldn't just be language, but I think a business outcome for a bank is not get shut down by the FSA.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is one of the drivers for change may be a business outcome. But at the very top, you know, you look at your drivers for change, you look at government legislation, you look at all the other things. And if that's your starter for 10, you know, and then you drill down, the outcomes are just one of the drivers for change. Okay, so for instance,
Just give a little example that sort of sits on the boundary. So the
I'm being devil's advocate here, by the way.
The current Chief Information Officer, or CDIO, I think, in the other days, a chap named Mike Stone, who came from Serco, where Serco
And BT and the Army.
and BT and the Army won the contract to look after the defence business services, whether it be invoicing, vetting, those sorts of things. And they had an innovative contract that said for every pound they saved, they were going to get quite a large chunk of that. But if they
So
saved...
don't talk about Serco, I worked in electronic tag.
Yeah. But they were going to get quite a lot of money out of that. And actually they had to build an architecture that was going to allow them to make the right interventions at the right time, whilst never dropping the service level, because reaching the service level was an immediate red card on the contract. So,
Yeah, I think with Serco, I mean, they inherit existing systems and existing procedures. With Serco, they have a company or something. And
this,
they were working in that framework.
yeah, well, this particular one was they didn't get anything. They had to take it over and run it, and they got nothing unless they made it better.
Oh, that's good. That's good contracting. Andrew, you were shaking your head vehemently there. Give us a thought.
Well, I have a lot of experience in terms of where John's come from in terms of I work every day with the military. And I don't just recognise this as, this to me is much more in terms of delivering decision support day to day to those decision makers, rather than if you sat down and we're going to go through some kind of strategic business transformation architectural review. So that's the only thing I don't particularly see this
I mean,
as
we're talking about
a military mindset, because this is service design thinking more than anything else, rather than EA specifically.
Right, okay. I'm just
And the military don't really do EA.
All right, so let's part
That's the key.
There's a difference between.
Can you talk a bit about iterations?
Yeah.
You've talked about it. You talked about agile. How do you design those iterations? What are the timescales? What are the cycles that you're looking at there?
Okay, so we're a relatively small company. We can't do a whole pile of work for a couple of years and then hope that it sort of goes in. So maybe our approach is coloured by our context. But we would, by and large, go in and do something really, really, really quick in order to prove that you could go through that loop once.
How quick?
5 to 8 weeks.
What would be the deliverable? Sorry, I was talking to another consultancy who kind of said the same thing. What would be the deliverables after 5 to 6 weeks? Because wouldn't it take that long to understand the technology landscape? You know, if you've got a SAP estate, for example.
Yeah, so the data is always going to be troublesome, but by and large, and for lots of organisations, the data isn't held in places like SAP, it's held in lots of private, almost data stores and things like that. You go in, you say, I want to make a decision, these are the sorts of decisions I'm going to make, this is the sort of roles that I'm going to support, this is the type of data that I'm expecting to see, and sometimes, absolutely, you have to stub it, because connecting to it is tricky, but you start to then put together the wireframes, and I spoke about it earlier, it's about delivering the wireframes of what it's going to look like. And when the guy on the other end of the desk is saying, yes, I absolutely need one of those to be populated with my proper data, then you've done iteration 1. That then leads you into 2 and 3 and 4, and you progressively wire it up. So project in the MOD for us has been going on for 2.5 years, big project for us, but we were delivering things at the beginning, and we're definitely delivering things at the end. We had a really bad phase in the middle.
It's not a project, that's a program.
Yeah, and to be honest, very often things that should be programs constitute themselves as projects because of entry in them.
entryism.
Oh, entryism. I'm going to buy that thing that's only really small because I've got a budget to afford the thing that's really small, but deep down I want to buy something really big. So you build something small and you prove the case. If I say I'd like to spend 3 years and £19 million on a business intelligence project for you, it'll be absolutely marvellous in 3 years, and it's going to cost you however many hundreds of pounds, thousands of pounds. Are you going to buy that straight away, or are you, if I come to you with something that is more tractable and improve the point, then you'll do that. And with this information things, I think we're moving away from very big bang implementation at the tail end, just because so many of them have not gone terribly well.
Can you elucidate on how your organisation approaches Agile? Does it have you have an approach or a method? Do you train your staff to think in terms of 5 to 8 weeks? How do you get them to be, self-starters, getting off their backside and getting stuff done? That's some of the stuff you talk about here. How have you got that culture and that attitude with
People that are really rubbish, I tell them keep them not. So ignoring the fact that we're a software company and a services company, and our software company does the agile thing very much according to the agile book. So how do we put that sort of thinking into a services type contract? In many ways, it is by the nature of how it sort of gets contracted. So something will be contracted and it'll be quite small, and we will put 3 people on it by and large. We'll put somebody who's really good at this bit, and we'll get somebody who's really good at that bit, we'll get somebody who's pretty good at that bit, and we will try and make something really quickly, and we will try and understand, and we will start to, whilst at the same time delivering wireframes that don't do anything, start working out what architecture we're going to need going on. So when I talked about the proofs of concept projects that we did, so it's taken about 6 months, we have refactored the back end every time, because every time we put the wireframe up with a little bit of data in front, we uncover something new. So what we're not trying to do is study it to death, then build it, then deliver it. We're trying to do all 3 of those things all at the same time.
And are you getting paid each time you refactor it? Or you
We're
getting paid
such a
at the end
small
of 6
company, we
months?
do nothing without getting paid. Yeah.
I'm just thinking from the customer side. I'm paying for wireframes.
Yeah. Well, you could go to somebody else and pay for a whole pile of PowerPoint.
What you are paid for, you're reducing the risk.
You're reducing the risk, and actually very often you're delivering insight. If you can have a conversation and the guy says, I want to see everything, and you manage to convince them they don't want to see everything, but they want to see an aggregated view, then you have given them some insight into what the information that they're going to need to make the decision looks like. Apocryphal story, the chief of the air staff was being shown, and we could do absolutely no traction whatsoever. And the guy said, well, a dozen people go into his office every day with a whole pile of slides and tell him a story about why he should do something. And he says those stories are almost always in conflict with each other. The operational side say, I can't fly because I haven't got the engineering. The engineering says they can't fly because the engineering doesn't have the supplies. The supplies says they can't fly because they don't do the engineering because of the HR. The whole story about how things work is in this very siloed individual system supporting individual things. It doesn't work very easily because people put together the slides that tell their story. If you provide the chief of the air staff a management information thing that shows him what the supply systems are saying and what the engineering systems are saying, and you say, pick that operation and then link it to the aircraft that are earmarked for it, that are linked to the engineering tasks that are earmarked for it, which are linked to the supply tasks that are and you get a thing that says, yes, you can, or no, you can't do that job.
So I think in support of what you said a minute ago, that three-in-a-box model supports the Californian startup mentality of hustler, hacker and designer, if I understand correctly, because you've got the hustler at the top making things happen, or rather making the right things happen. You've got a hacker at the bottom, quite clearly hacking your data, and you've got a designer making sure that how people feel when they're using it or they're going to use it, is right on the left-hand side in terms of the persona. So, if I understood correctly,
I hadn't heard the phrase before, but I really like it. Yeah, yeah, I'm okay with that. I'm quite comfortable with that. Yeah, and you can't have this one up here because that person will just promise magic carpets. You can't have this guy here because he'll disappear and you'll never see him again. It needs to be joined up, and I think that the hinge on this is what's the user doing, what are their goals, and I mean their proper goals, not what does it say on their reporting thing, and what things do they do in their day-to-day life that they find difficult because they don't have access to the things that should be contained in an architecture in order to help them make the decision.
That was a great, I read that, Darren Hustler.
hustler, hacker and designer.
Really like that. Really like that. Can we talk about this? Because we haven't really talked about this.
Yeah.
How do you measure the effectiveness of these decisions and interventions? How do you know that you've done it better once you've got one of these than you had it before? And indeed, you talked about that sort of overload situation, of the person's got too many decisions to make in their brain. Tell me about that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so you could measure it in terms of how many models are you trying to hit every day and how quickly are they appearing.
Yeah.
Wiring that up is going to be tricky. So it is, you're going to have to do this at a sort of aggregated layer in its own right. Very often when we're delivering something for these decision makers, there is a layering in there as well. So not only will we talk to the chief executive of the organisation, we'll talk to his financial director, we'll talk to the other guys who are doing stuff for them. What information do they need to give him the right sorts of decisions? Right information to which to make those decisions. It is relatively subjective, I would say. But there is growing evidence of the return on investment in these, very often done through case studies. Before I had this, it looked like this and it wasn't very good, and now I've got this and I can do this and I can see that and I don't need to do that. Some of the return on investment is extremely prosaic. Shell, for it, probably shouldn't mention commercial companies, disregard that, a large oil company. A group of people spending literally the thick end of a month in advance of a quarterly review, putting together all of the slides that are going to be reviewed. Actually, they put together 140 slides. One of these management information things should be less than that number. And what we found when doing this was very often the designer, one of the things that he'd be doing is looking at the management information slides in a very sort of static way and say, actually, what are they trying to get from this? And so if you can take the 70-ish people that are putting that slide deck together over a month and just recover that in op costs, this is a return on investment. Whether they're then making the right decision, because of course, we plug the data in to populate the diagrams that we saw in PowerPoint, and all the things that should have been green went red. What was happening there? And what was happening there is that every time this PowerPoint got adjusted, the shading went from one end of the spectrum. Every time it moved through a layer of staffing, it went a bit greener. So not only is there a return in terms of saving proper people, but actually you're removing some of the colouring in.
Professor, do you have a view on that?
What, the last comment?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's, having worked for corporates as well as academic environments, what you're talking is about that filtering effect and people, as it goes up the line, they do not want to show a scorecard which is full of red. And I guess what you're saying is by going to the raw data, you're seeing how it really is.
Yeah.
That's your point, I guess.
Yeah. And a couple of times, what that will show is data's wrong, business logic's wrong, it's completely legit, or somebody's telling fibs. All of those are very useful bits of insight.
Any more thoughts? Yes.
Again, coming from the business intelligence and information management space, I think we touched on a crucial benefit of doing the front end of this. It is to synthesise different functional groups, different views of the as-is, or the what should be, into one coherent understanding. Other modelling techniques that do that, system thinking is one of the key ones. Bringing that benefit to me seems very worthwhile.
Yeah, so bringing this stuff together from different parts of the organisation would be terribly powerful. I like this story because maybe a bit, a friend of mine was working for the National Air Traffic, and I don't know if you know, but Heathrow handles 50 planes an hour, whatever the number is. And, air traffic controllers are, their job is to get that number of planes on the ground inside that time. A colleague of mine built a management thing that had the time delays in every part, from getting the plane to the ground, getting it to the gate, getting the passengers off, getting the baggage into reclaim, getting them out the door. I don't know if we went quite as far as getting them out of the car park, but you can imagine the causal links in there. What they did was they were looking at some data, and there was one air traffic controller that actually managed to get 2 more planes on the ground every hour than most of his colleagues. He was overperforming. Do you think that's a good story or a bad story? So what was happening is they were arriving on the ground earlier, in more of a rush. The plan went slightly pear-shaped, but there's now a push to get them to the gate, so they make them taxi further than they would otherwise have been, which means that everything to do with the luggage has to move a little bit further. Passengers with slight disadvantages or disabilities then need to be moved further. More problems associated with baggage. Actually, more planes on the ground faster, or rather not at the right tempo, actually had a horrible impact that then had a tail that was about 12 hours.
Wow.
You're sub-optimising one part of the system, not
Well, yeah, he thought he was locally optimising, and what he'd done was throw everything else out. Now, that's the sort of thing you can start to do if you say, we want to look after these various functional areas, and actually what's the data going to come together like that on that?
I've got a slightly different experience in working with this, because this comes from a long time ago when I was working for a large airline that operates out of Heathrow, a lot of planes. And we discovered lots of people going to go off and build little data marts, and they're all going to use different products, and you can see those getting being generated. And we had enough influence to say, why don't we build a data warehouse and only extract the data marts from the systems. And we got a real rock star data modeler in, and he modelled everything around entities and events, nothing to do with personas or even drawings, all around entities and events. He modelled the world, we had an enterprise data model, built the data warehouse, it was brilliant. And somebody came along with a weird requirement that nobody had thought of, and was able to produce it in a couple of days. Because the theory model was very good thing, and the physical design was very flexible, so in a sense, if you're really good at this, it becomes very flexible, and you don't have to worry too much about it. So that was the experience. Anybody else?
Yeah, I saw a case of that back in the 90s. I had a really wizard data architect working for me, and they transformed a bank in 6 months, just through the hacker, I suppose, and the design and getting a real understanding of the as-is and to-be there. So I wasn't part of the case, but you described it in a very vivid way.
Yeah, in this case, my role was just to get people talking, and then brilliant people running, and we basically got the project established as a corporate project. That was our job as architects, if you like, to identify corporate things that would be of wide benefit. That was really the enterprise architecture and commercial organisation.
Just putting my own caveat, I'm not suggesting for a minute that we don't need those things, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that we don't need operating models, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that we don't need to do a lot of these things, and that done well, they deliver enormous value. What I'm suggesting is that there's a danger that this happens in the background and doesn't have the serendipitous exposure, or actually gets canned beforehand, but actually putting a layer above some of these projects to join them up is still valuable thing to do.
It's almost creating an app. Yeah.
So I think that's applicable when the organization is ready to, invest something upfront, and also is ready to have a team who's working in silo, not silo, but in the background, getting the things ready for any, requirement that has come, nobody has thought about and all that. We are in an environment where on a daily basis, now it's a bit exaggeration, but on a daily basis we are being asked, what are you producing and how is it going to help the business? And in that case, I think this model might work in our organization as well. But we are really struggling to have an enterprise architect team of people who are working in the background. We are now being challenged more and more to show the results and share as soon as possible. So probably I relate to this story more.
Well, are you being challenged because you have improved the value proposition of the enterprise architecture?
Partly because of that.
That's why you're being challenged.
Yes.
If the proposition has been shown to senior level management, you get the green card, so long as you're delivering. If you're sitting in the background.
But this is not a one-off activity of having a value proposition showcased and agreed. It's something which needs to be continuous. So once you have a value proposition agreed and understood by senior management, this gives you a method or a platform through which you show the continued value add. I just translated that, Ray.
I'm not uncomfortable with this as a wrapper on a lot of the extremely valuable, high worth activities that are associated with enterprise architecture and those sorts of things. I think this is about putting or exposing that in a way that people can interact with it in the same way that they interact with things, as Lord says, as an app.
It's got enterprise architecture as an app. There you go. So we've got 5 minutes to go. We'll have one more question and then we'll wrap up elegantly.
Yeah, I guess, as you'd expect from Henry, you see a model and you want to change it.
So you become a professor.
Sorry.
So here's my attempt to integrate what you're saying, because although you say, it's nice to have operating models and everything else in the background, I think really what you're saying is that making decisions is a lot more important than building an architecture. Perhaps I'm paraphrasing it wrong. Just to bring that in, I think if you make that strategic decisions and interventions and replace data feedback with enterprise architecture, I think for me that starts to combine very nicely the sort of things that we're trying to say, which is that we are trying to build something that's long term, but it's also got to be very much business driven. It's absolutely got to meet stakeholder needs in terms of key decisions. I think that's got really interesting. Let's talk again about that.
So certainly the genesis of this was some of the stuff that Scott has done recently on their strategy to execution. In order to make stuff execute, you need stuff that actually properly works. You can't just magic this up, but the understanding of how the strategy reaches down and is executed.
Thanks for that. I like that, and I think it's been a great discussion. I'd like to round out with one last question, because the title is Architecture Making It Real Time. Yeah, and can you just give a summary of your thoughts around this move towards real time? I mean, you talked about this iteration being 10 weeks, but how is this whole speeding up and the need for us to have information much more real time actually impacting this?
Yeah, so the speed of response to the system is very often a non-functional. But in this particular case, I think we're being driven by the stuff that is happening elsewhere. The expectation of the senior decision makers is that they should be able to access the information in their organisation without commissioning a 3-month, 3-year piece of work in order to get it.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you. We have filmed it, and hopefully it will be on the website. Is there anything else to? Yeah. Oh, we'd like to have a present. Networking.